We do have some questions, and I'm going to invite Storm Potts from Sasol to share her question with the panelists broadly, and then we can take additional questions. If anybody has a question that they would like to ask, if you could raise your hand or insert it in the chat box, and we can get the panelists to then respond.
Hi, thanks everybody. This was a great discussion. My question is maybe aimed more at Tony and Jessica. So I stand under correction here, but to my knowledge, South Africa hasn't actually ever had a successful issuance of carbon credits for these types of projects. So I'd like to understand why we haven't been able to utilize the carbon offset market to scale up any of these projects in the past, given obviously the huge the carbon benefits related to it. And if related to that, are there any plans to use this mechanism, this type of market mechanism in the future?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm unaware of projects, of land use projects in South Africa that have generated carbon offsets. I stand to be corrected though, but I'm aware of a few that are going through the VCS standard, but I'm not quite sure if they've been verified and if offsets have been issued as yet. But in terms of why not, there's a number of reasons. The first is the costs of validation and verification. Going through, for example, the VCS standard costs a fair amount, and the auditors cost a fair amount. And often our projects are too small to actually make it worth one's while to have them validated. So I think that's a primary reason. And linked to that is that within South African biomes, our carbon stocks are generally relatively low. Okay, so a typical South African landscape like a savanna one has about 10 tons of carbon per hectare. Standard sequestration rates are around a ton of CO2e per hectare per year. And you compare that to the tropics where, for example, within the Congo belt, tons per year, and one has carbon stocks. Sure, we've measured some plots in the Congo basin with 300 tons a hectare. So that's why in South Africa it has been limited to date.
Hi, Jessica, were you going to add anything to that?
Sure. I mean, I think Tony's sort of hit the nail on the head there. So there are a few difficulties around the verification and the auditing of carbon benefits, and at a small scale, very often it is just too difficult to verify and way too costly. So not only is actually implementing this very difficult, but I think there was a delay in getting the carbon market to be viable. There are plans I know of to bridge these gaps with some large-scale projects. I know that under the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, this is being investigated. So I'm hoping that in the next decade, we will see some fairly large-scale projects which do incorporate carbon credits. And hopefully that will set the scene, as it were, for further projects.
Thanks, Jessica. Just to add to that, Storm, I do believe that there have been at least two registered projects. I haven't checked in a while using VCS credits in the Eastern Cape, something around the Addo Elephant Park, National Park. So it's worthwhile perhaps just checking on the VCS website as well for more information. I do think that there's also, I think the beauty of ecosystem-based approaches is that you probably have a secondary sort of revenue generation stream. But in addition to that, you have a whole host of services and benefits that you're getting from a much healthier ecosystem. One of which, the services that is now provided is the ability to sequester carbon, but there are other benefits around productivity and flood attenuation, as the case may be, or just improving the productivity of that ecosystem as a whole. So I think in these types of initiatives, there's often the opportunity to then combine and elevate both those adaptation benefits as well as the mitigation benefits that are also available. I had one question, just mindful of the time, and if I don't see any additional questions being asked, that I wanted to address to both Julia and Barney. You mentioned in your presentations that you were mapping, shall I say, EBA priority areas. And I thought to what extent you are seeing landscape-based or large-scale projects that are covering, kind of whole areas as a basis for further action, simply because you have already mapped out where EBA can be implemented, and perhaps using that as a basis for getting businesses that are either located in those areas or whose supply chains, or whatever the case may be impacted or benefiting from those systems to participate in larger projects.
So I think, we certainly are trying to achieve landscape scale with some of our projects, but it's not easy, and it really does depend on collaboration of many partners. So for example, in the Eastern Cape, we've helped set up a partnership platform called the Umzimvubu Catchment Conservation Program, and there's 27 different partners, including local government, NGOs, private sector, kind of all working together to try and achieve landscape scale restoration. And I think we're quite close to reaching a tipping point there, with Meet Naturally really working very well in the grassland system. But it's not easy because it requires coordination and it requires funding. And it's only when you have a sort of an independent model that starts to drive independent action that I think we will see restoration happening at a landscape scale. Having said that, in the Northern Cape, where we have much lower population densities and much larger communal grazing areas, we've been able to get up to 150,000 hectares under a single management system, which is the beginnings of reaching a landscape scale. So I think, the long and the short of it is it takes time. You've really got to have a model that's replicable, that's easily financeable, and ultimately you need lots of independent actors to agree to implement activities with or without grant finance to be able to go to a landscape scale. If you depend purely on grant finance, it's very difficult to see action happening at the scale of a whole catchment or a broader landscape.
Thank you very much, Julia. Barney, I'm not sure if you've got a few minutes just to add your thoughts.
Yeah, I think I agree with Julia, but at the same time, I'd like to say that there are certain sort of developments that are taking place that we need to build on. The landscape level thinking, it's out there now. We are talking about it and we see it as a viable option, hopefully in the long term, once we've addressed some of these things that Julia has mentioned. And through some of the grant funding that is coming through now, EKI, people have seen the call and so on. So this gives us an opportunity now to start testing some of these things at that scale, because in a way, the big funds that are out there kind of like begin to sort of facilitate the implementation of the thinking of landscape level. And there's so many other sort of, initiatives like Man and Biosphere Reserves. That's where we can also be looking, how do we build on that, to move to a landscape level scale. Thanks.
Thank you, Barney. I just wanted to ask you, Tony, based on your insights and all the projects that you sort of reviewed as part of the work you did, to what extent did you find business or the private sector being active in those projects? Were they mainly NGO-driven or government-driven?
They are principally NGO and government-driven. Yeah, I'd say probably at least 90% of them are. But there are entities that are starting to come on board. I think one of the classic examples is Tongaat Hewlett. For example, it's the large sugarcane producer. They own, I stand to be corrected, but I think they own about 40% of the area that is eThekwini municipality. And Deborah Roberts' team started engaging with them about 5 years ago on EBA, and initially had got quite a firm response back. eThekwini was actually in court against Tongaat on another matter at the time. But over the last few years, through engagement, they've brought them on board. And now Tongaat is one of the principal implementers of EBA in that greater area. They essentially restoring riverine and wetland areas on the land under their custodianship. So there are examples coming through. And aside from that, I think there's other companies that do it by default anyway. For example, the plantation companies, often to fulfill their FSC standard requirements, they need to manage riverine areas in the greater plantation estate in a certain way. So yeah, there are some private sector owners certainly coming on board, but there's obviously a lot more needed.
Thank you very much, Tony. I also just wanted to touch on what you had mentioned about monitoring of projects and the understanding then the impacts of things that have been implemented. And I was just thinking of what Feroz had also mentioned about how they've paid a lot of attention to that aspect of the work that they're doing on their farming project. And I wanted to get a sense from you, Feroz, the kind of the resource intensity that's required to undertake the monitoring. Is it a large part of the project? And what can others learn from that in terms of understanding the impacts of EBA-based approaches?
Okay, so yeah, I think given the type of monitoring we do, it's quite an intensive program, and which is why we need to partner with third parties. So internally, we've got project managers who run the program, but all the evaluation and farm visits and analysis happens through the agronomists, this continuous engagement with farmers through the process, working with labs and so on. And so the resources required are not just from a people perspective, but it is financial resources as well. So we fund this program. To date, we funded it ourselves, and it's a fairly expensive program as well. And so you need a big ecosystem, I would imagine, or a strong system to manage and monitor and track and look at improvements and do the analysis and that kind of thing.
Thank you, Feroz. I'd also like to alert everybody that we're wrapping up on phase 1 of the project, as Steve mentioned earlier on, and we will be moving to phase 2, which will be diving a little bit more into individual case studies and using that as a basis for convening and understanding in detail how we, the NBI member companies and the broader community that are interested, can start developing concrete proposals for GCF submission over the next few months. I see that we had one last question, so if I may squeeze that in before we close. Storm, you can go ahead.
Very quick question, maybe directed to Barney. Does DEFF potentially see the role of biodiversity offsets playing a role in getting the private sector involved in any of these initiatives?
Storm, I think Barney has had to leave the conversation, but okay. Seeing as how I used to work at DEFF not too long ago, and I had been involved just in a very small capacity on the development of an offsets policy, generally speaking, and that biodiversity is definitely one of the areas that is covered in that broad thinking. I'm not sure to what extent it's been developed, but there is definitely some level of consideration at national department level. And with that, I think we can close the meeting. Again, just to let you know, we are starting with phase 2 soon. We will be posting various communications on the work we'll be doing this phase, and this community of practice that we've started to build on understanding what's happening in the South African landscape and what we as the NBI and member companies and others can start implementing concrete projects. Thank you very much for your participation, and I look forward to working with all of you over the next few months. Thank you very much to all the speakers who joined us and who've just shared their insights. And I'm sure we will be working with you too as we go forward on this project.